The fire was intense. It was in a double-wide mobile home, and those tend to burn very readily. When I arrived on scene, there was a fair amount of damage. Some of the windows had been blown out a distance away from the house. It appeared that there may have been some type of a vapor explosion. Pressure built up inside when gasoline was ignited that pushed the glass out from the frame. There was a bedroom that had some fire damage, and in that area was where there was a red plastic gasoline container that seemed extremely out of place. Some of these things just didn't seem normal for a regular fire.
Shortly after crews put out the fire inside this Bemidji mobile home, investigators found a body inside.
Once we looked inside, we found out that there was a body of a female, and there was a mattress on top of her. After removing some debris, it was noticed that her hands were in fact bound with what appeared to be duct tape.
It turned it into a homicide investigation at that point, in belief that someone was trying to cover something up by setting the place on fire.
Police are investigating the death at the mobile home as murder, and they are trying to piece together a timeline of events.
Our victim at the scene was Melissa Norby.
Melissa's cousin had called me that morning and says, "Please tell me it's not true." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And she goes, "Melissa's house is on fire." And I'm like, "What?" "My daughter is over there."
An officer contacted me and said that there was a female at the barricades that said her daughter had spent the night with Melissa. So I went out. I saw Amanda.
We searched through again. We were confident there was no other human remains in the fire.
It went from a homicide investigation to now we had an active missing child case.
It was discovered that 5-year-old had been visiting the residence the evening that the fire occurred.
The weekend of the 22nd of June, Melissa called me. She said, "Can I come get your daughter to spend the night with me?" It was routine. She would take my kids overnight, and, sometimes she would take them for 3 days because I trusted her.
I asked Amanda about what their fire safety plan would be at home. I wanted to know what her daughter would do in a fire. And Amanda said that her daughter would go outside and she would hide.
A team of investigators and volunteers searched the area, but they could not find the missing 5-year-old.
We were thinking there was no way that if we hadn't found her that, we thought that she had been taken.
I never thought in a million years that this would be an arson to cover up a homicide, to cover up an abduction. This girl's been missing since roughly 3 o'clock in the morning. We're worried that time is not on our side. We're worried that we're gonna be recovering as opposed to rescuing.
I was really scared. You hear about it all the time. If you don't find your child within the first, 24 hours, you probably won't get her back. My heart dropped to the floor. I said, "I don't care what you have to do, find her."
We began to do victimology, talking to everyone who may provide us some little piece of information about Melissa's life.
We started to learn more about Melissa Norby's life through interviews with coworkers and her friends.
Melissa's cousin was interviewed by agents regarding Melissa's relationships with other males. Her cousin told the agents that she was aware that Melissa had been seeing a male recently from the Bemidji area.
So you are the cousin to Melissa?
Correct.
We talked about possible people who would be associated with Melissa or around her.
I knew the name Jake from very personal conversations Melissa and I had. She said they had been playing it rough She was into, not S&M, but more like daddy, little girl, stuff like that.
You know how they met?
Melissa is always online.
Melissa referred to him as Jake. She was also able to provide that this individual also owned a food truck.
We called the city clerk looking for our food truck licensees, and she told us Jake's Eats is owned by Jacob Ken. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. We all knew his name.
It was like a light bulb went off because we were familiar with him in investigations.
Jacob Ken had child pornography convictions. He had tried to purchase a young girl online for photographing purposes.
Based on his past history, based on his relationship with Melissa, Jacob Ken was likely our guy. He was on probation at the time of this investigation. We asked the probation officer to call him and say, you know how these things work. Every time a kid goes missing, they always look at the people who are on probation for similar crimes. Just come on in, it's not a big deal. You'll be excluded very quickly. The whole idea of making a very nonchalant encounter. The first thing we do, we reach out to the cell phone company and begin to get locations for Jacob's cell phone.
We wanted to know exactly where he was.
Jake, this is Chad. Good. Jake is also at the PCA. How you doing? Good. Good. How are you? Good.
Agent Girardi and Agent Museus had been tasked with interviewing Mr. Kin when he arrived at the law enforcement center that night, largely because they didn't know him, they didn't have any connection to him.
All right, you came into the police department, we're inside the interview room, you got two officers talking to you, we want you, you're not under arrest. You understand that? Yep.
Yep. And Jake, if there's any point that you don't want to talk to us, walk right out the door and walk through the double doors just like you came in. And it's fine.
When Ken first came in, it was important for us to just establish rapport with him. That was my goal, not challenge him or get him upset that he would walk out of the interview room.
Here's the deal. We get missing kids, guess who the first people we talk to?
Us?
Yeah.
I already knew that. I figured, but...
And that's why you're here?
You've seen the reports of this missing girl? Have you seen... I haven't seen any reports.
Okay.
My ex brought it up because her boyfriend works for the fire department. But,
yeah, did you hear about the fire?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do know that lady, actually. And what's her name? Melissa Norby. If that's right. Yeah. When's the last time that you've seen her? Like 6 or 8 months ago. Oh, so it's been a long time. Yeah.
He didn't know that Melissa had talked to her cousin about Jacob being back in her life, so he probably thought that we weren't aware of that information.
There was a fire, there was a body found. We don't know what happened, okay?
I stopped at her house once.
Was that a house at Hillcrest?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was like a year and a half ago. I stopped there.
As we're interviewing Jacob, and we know because we've talked to all these other people who say they're in a relationship. They know each other well, and I'm watching to see how he is going to answer the question. He is distancing himself from her, and there's only one reason why.
Deadly house fire yesterday morning. Fire started around 3:30 in the morning.
Police in Bemidji search for a 5-year-old girl.
She was last seen wearing a black shirt, a pink skirt, and a pink bandage on her arm.
All right, last 48 hours.
Oh, let's see.
We want him to lock in his time frame, establish his timeline on where he was and who he had been with.
Where did you just come from?
Well, I was fishing up north.
Okay. Fishing where?
Clear Lake.
Clear Lake. Catch anything?
No, I wish.
What were you fishing for?
Bass.
Okay.
We just want to keep him talking because the more he talks, the more comfortable he is. So when we do ask the hard questions, he feels comfortable enough with our relationship to answer them.
Okay, let's, just so I can verify whereabouts. So if I'm gonna drive up there, what does it look like? What, something, you know?
It's like a lake.
Okay.
I don't know what really this has to do with tonight, though. I mean, it's...
Okay. All right. Well, help me out with it so we can cross it off our list. Our resort? Good. Is it marked resort? The sign that says resort? Okay. How many cabins are there?
I don't know. I haven't counted.
All right.
But I just don't know why it matters, you know, where I was fishing tonight.
There was very little eye contact. He had held a defensive posture. He became defensive over very basic questions to establish alibi when these were questions that most people would have no problem answering.
Having that prior knowledge of where his cell phone location was, and he started to give us a different story of his location.
Were you fishing with anybody?
No.
He had no knowledge that we had a cell phone location prior to the interview.
So from 7 till, you know, a little while ago, you're out fishing.
Yeah.
You're pretty sure on your time frame?
I'm positive.
Okay.
He told us that he had been fishing by North Home, Minnesota, but his actual location was near Big Fork, Minnesota. And those two locations were approximately 30 miles apart. So we knew that was likely a lie, but lies are just as good as the truth in our business, especially when we can prove that he's lying.
Everything you told us is the truth?
Yes.
Okay. Your whereabouts, anything like that?
My whereabouts are exactly what I told you.
His story about going to where he was at was just a blatant lie.
At this point, I'm not confronting him on those lies. I'm just letting him talk. I'm fairly laid back. You'll see that my legs are kind of stretched out. My arms are crossed. In fact, I'm pretending to sound somewhat disinterested. And the reason for that is I'm gathering information. The more information we're gathering, the more relationship building is occurring.
This, Melissa, did you ever have sex with her? Never? Even years ago?
No.
Do you have any way to get a hold of her? Or?
No.
Okay. Did she ever want to have sex with you? Did she tell you that?
She texted flirty stuff, but...
And when was the last time that you got a text message from her?
Like 6 or 8 months ago.
He's already told us some stuff that contradicts what he told us before. I didn't have a way to get a hold of her, but she's flirty in her text messages?
Jake, everything you told us is true.
Yes.
There's nothing that's going to interfere with your recollection of your timeline and where you were.
Once we felt we got all that information from him, it was time to start confronting him on what we actually knew and to find out why he doesn't want to go there.
Tonight, the investigation continues. 5-year-old was discovered missing after a fatal mobile home fire.
look for a 5-year-old, and I hope you find her.
There is a time in which the investigators determine we are moving from an interview to a confrontation.
Jake, we got reports that you had a relationship with Melissa.
There was never actually a relationship, which is what I already said.
It was a balance of how hard should we push him and confront him on what we know.
What about her coworkers where she's working now?
I don't know any of the coworkers.
Okay, well, the coworkers indicated that you guys were having sex.
I don't know any of the coworkers, so I can't say anything to that.
Jake remains in the same position he has been in this entire interview. Every chance that he gets to say I didn't do it, he's saying I didn't do it.
They said you're having sex. You're, again, saying, no way.
No.
We're at a stalemate here. There were several times where Paul or I would leave the room. Sometimes we find people confess better to one person than two.
Your lake? Who can put you at that lake?
Nobody.
Nobody?
I'm still not seeing why that matters at all.
I'll tell you why. Basically, Jake, your cell phone doesn't put you in that spot tonight.
We started asking very pointed questions and questions that challenged his alibi and challenged him, his story to us, getting him to try to account for the information that we know.
Where were you when called me? At the lake.
That's where you are. That's where your cell phone is.
I don't know how that would happen, but yeah, I wasn't in Big Fort. I had no reason to be in Big Fort.
The frustration level increased with him, being uncomfortable answering questions. You could see that in his demeanor.
Step up, Paul, you're free.
Paul and I both leave the room, and that was a time in which we wanted to make sure we'd covered all our bases.
When Jacob Kennedy showed up at the sheriff's department, we observed right away that his boots were wet, his pants were wet. We walked outside and took a look at his vehicle and saw flower material and weeds. So it looked like he'd been driving off of the road.
Jacob parked right in front of the law enforcement center. His vehicle looked like it had been driving out in a field, certainly not to a resort to go fishing like he said he was.
We said, all right, let's do a search warrant on the vehicle. Let's do a search warrant on his person and for his house.
The atmosphere at the police department at that point was like a full court press. Everybody is high intensity. We're aware of the clock. If we don't find her in the first 24 hours, the chances of her being alive are pretty much none.
We'd step out of the room, not only to get advice on what to ask next, but what's Jacob's body language looking like without us in the room? He appeared stressed. He appeared as though this was the last place he wanted to be.
All right, I'm leaving now. Like I said, I was going to do one 5 times, but they kept, like, goodbye.
He was going to leave, and we wanted to keep him there.
I don't want to hold him in the room because then, constitutionally, it looks like a detention. We're still waiting for search warrants. We're still waiting for other pieces of information. We want to keep him in that room. So we kind of walk this fine line, hoping that he stays there willingly.
I'm going to show you a couple more pictures. You want to see? Gas can. Have you seen this before?
Look familiar?
No. Looks familiar. I own a few gas cans.
You don't want one like that?
I own one like it, and it's at my house. That gas can was found at the arson site. Okay.
He probably thought the gas can went up in the fire and was surprised that there was actually a gas stand fully intact, still at the fire scene.
The entire focus of our evening is this little girl.
Yeah. I didn't do anything to the little girl. I haven't seen the little girl. I haven't seen Melissa in a long time. I haven't done anything.
Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to proceed.
The confrontation of we think that you abducted the 5-year-old occurs right here.
We're going to collect some evidence, and the evidence will show either you did or you didn't. Okay, like what? Any evidence on you? Any evidence in your vehicle? Any evidence in your house?
We're going to be executing a search warrant.
It's fine. Okay.
You can't have access to those things right now.
I have to. I can't sleep anywhere else. And you don't have the search warrant yet.
It's being done. I'll go check the status of the court orders. All right.
So what happens when I drive away? Because I don't see a court order. I don't see a warrant. I'm trying to play along and been telling you guys the truth.
Can we run you up to your house and get you some clothes?
No.
Okay. You're not going. Sit down.
No.
Sit down.
You said I was free to leave.
Sit down.
You said I was free to leave.
Sit down.
We all knew it. Jacob Kinn was likely our guy. We were very aware of the urgency and the time that we didn't have. We want to keep him in that room to gather the evidence to find this little girl.
At this point, you're going to have a seat.
We knew that we'd put the pressure on, and he wants to leave.
Sit down.
You said I was free to leave.
Sit down.
We have opted to try to keep him there in order to get the search warrant signed.
At this point, I want to call an attorney.
You can call whoever you want.
Have a seat.
Have a seat. You're being detained.
You're being detained right now.
Court order.
Okay. So have a seat.
We're awaiting the signature from a judge on the search warrants. I made the decision that he needs to stay here. Legally, we're able to detain him for a short period of time, waiting for that search warrant to get signed.
The court order's coming. All right.
You said I was free to leave, so then when I say I want to leave, it's you have to stay.
At this point in the interview, he's had enough. I believe he's read between the lines that we know far more than what he believed we knew.
We search your house, your person, your clothes. We find no connection. Guess what?
We move on to the next person.
So if I hand over my keys and my clothes, could I call my parents and have them come pick me up?
Definitely. You definitely.
You're wrestling around in your head. It's like, we should just arrest him, put him behind bars. And then it was, do I have enough to arrest him? But with the investigative team there, it was, all right, we're going to let him walk.
Hey. Hello? Can you come pick me up from the police department?
We just didn't feel that there was probably enough to hold him at the time.
We watched Jacob Kinn walk out of our police department. Not in handcuffs, but a free man. He wasn't ready to confess. And time is not on our side, but we had other officers and agents investigating his vehicle, and it was evident to them that he'd been somewhere rural, and we were interested in where that was.
Part of the problem with the data that we got from the cell phone was it landed out in the middle of a very rural area in Big Fork.
We took the latitude and longitude coordinates provided by the Verizon telephone company. We were able to map those coordinates, and I put the cell phone as to possibly being 5.2 miles northeast of the cell phone tower in Big Fork, Minnesota.
We were doing a map reconnaissance of the area, checking to see what other houses might be in the area. We found a property listed to a relative, but Jacob, that was right in alignment with where that phone ping showed up at. We knew we had to go check.
Grabbed my vehicle, my squad, a pair of boots, got a full tank of gas, and we made the drive to Big Fork.
When we got close to the area up in Big Fork, it was just starting to get light out. We were looking for any spots where a vehicle might have pulled off or turned around.
It had rained the night before, and as we're driving up to the intersection of Township Road 288, which is a dirt road, heading west off of the paved two-lane road that we were driving on, we could see a set of vehicle tracks. To us, it looked like the tire tracks were very similar to Jacob Kinn's tracks on his Jeep that we had looked at previously.
It was exactly what we had traveled to Big Fork to find.
We got to the west end of the township road and saw that the tire tracks had coming out of a field road that also proceeded west and down a hill and into a low area. We parked the squad and proceeded on foot.
The grass was about knee-high, and we followed the tracks. It was probably at least a half-mile walk. I was afraid that we were going to find a little girl's body somewhere along that trail.
As we got up over the rise on the top of the field, we could see a pickup camper tucked back into the woods. The tracks pulled right up to the south side of the camper.
I walked up to the camper, and the door was tied tight with a big wad of electrical tape. I was nervous, and I opened up the camper door. I didn't know what we were going to find.
We got up to the camper, and around the door of the camper, you could see that somebody had placed electrical tape around the doorknob to prevent the door from being opened. And Rob looked at me and I said, Rob, just go ahead and open it. And that's when we found her.
Hi, what did you say your name was again? I'm gonna take a little video. How'd you get here?
His friend got me here.
Don was right next to me. Turn on your cell phone, he said. We didn't have body cameras and stuff at the time.
Okay, you don't have to be scared, okay? We're the police.
I saw a little girl sitting on a bed. Looked like she had just woke up. Sitting there, 10 fingers, 10 toes.
My name's Rob and this is Don. How old are you?
Probably 5 or something.
Finding that little girl alive, I don't know if words can describe it.
Is there anybody else around here with you? Okay. Is it okay if we take a few more pictures? Okay.
We had a text thread going on to share information. Don took a picture of me and little girl and put it on that text thread.
6:15 a.m. is when I got the call from Don. He said, we have her. I said, alive? He said, alive.
What went through your mind at that moment?
That was fantastic. Never would have believed.
When I saw that text, it's still...
Are you thirsty? Okay.
For water.
It was amazing that we were able to find her alive.
My mommy's name is Amanda.
Okay.
They had called me and said, we have your daughter. She is safe. She is asking for her mom. I mean, I just want to hold her. I want to hug her. I want her in my arms.
She told us her name, her mother's name. We could see that she had tape around her legs, that she had tape around her arms.
Do you remember what Missy's friend looked like?
And she told us about the man that put her there.
What kind of car does he have?
White
She told us all these little bits of describing information that described Jacob Kinn to us.
What does he look like?
He has a beard.
I'd received a text from Don Newhouse that says, "She's alive, arrest him."
Jacob William Kinn, age 32, was identified as a person of interest.
I woke up to a picture of a girl that we had been looking for now 26, 27 hours, alive and well in an agent's arms. She's alive, arrest him.
And now we're like, where's Jacob right now? We need to find him and put cuffs on him.
Police found Jacob Kinn driving his dad's pickup, traveling back to where he had held her captive. They captured him and interviewed him again at the sheriff's office in Grand Rapids.
Our goal was, let's reconfirm his story, that he had no connection with Melissa Norby, and have him continue to deny that.
All right, Jake, you're under arrest. Okay, see that. Since you are in custody, I will read you the Miranda warning. Okay.
He was very smug in appearance, said very little, and I truly think when Agent Girardi and I walked into that interview room, he had no idea we knew what we knew.
Okay, all right. Has anything changed from we talked last?
No. Other than being confused as to why I'm being arrested now and what changed.
He was, well, why am I under arrest? What changed from a couple hours ago? So I just wanted to settle him down and let's move on from there.
Last night when we talked, you said you had no contact with Melissa Norby. Is that true?
Yeah.
And you had no contact with the little girl?
Having Ken retell us this, or his denial of him not being around Melissa was to head off any type of story that he might try to create or explain his actions. When you're in court,
nothing's changed from last night. 100% sure?
95% sure. What's the 5%? Yeah. I'm tired and groggy and you guys kept me up all night. But you didn't really answer my question.
What was your question?
What changed between 2 hours ago and now?
I had the photo that Don and Rob had sent me, and I just said, I'm just going to let him know he's caught.
Is that the 5% that you're talking about that you're not sure of?
That was a moment I won't forget.
You could have heard a pin drop when Agent Girardi pulled his phone out and brought up that picture. I'll remember this forever. He stared at that phone and looked at that photo. You can see him writhe in the chair a little bit, and he knew at that moment that we had him.
They put that piece of evidence in front of him and he shut down. That was really something to see.
Now, start over.
Now is the time, Jake. Okay, we know more than you think we do right now. And now's the time for you to fill in those blanks. Now's the time for you to come clean and tell us what really happened here and what's really gone on.
Take us through the night.
I try to play on his emotion. Tell us where you're at. Tell us what's happened. Let us fill in those gaps.
Start talking to Melissa against you. Weeks to a month ago. Okay. We actually hadn't had a sexual relationship, but we, role played on the phone.
Role played, and what was her role?
It was daddy, daughter, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Then I went over there the other night. What day? Today's Thursday.
Did you go there for her or for Melissa?
It was for Melissa, but it was...
Did you know that she was going to be there?
Yeah. You did know? I want an attorney.
He's actually smart enough to just say, I want to talk to an attorney. However, we had enough evidence that we knew what had happened anyway.
As investigators got through Jacob Kinn's phone and Melissa Norby's phone, there was information that they had planned this together, that Jacob would have a relationship with her if she gave him access to a child. The plot thickened again. It was like, how many times can this case have a twist and turn like that?
Melissa being involved to the extent that she was, it was a shock to everyone.
After the initial investigation and the arrest, we found a string of text messages that showed that this whole abduction was planned out, orchestrated, and discussed amongst Melissa and Jacob. They couldn't believe it.
It really felt like we were in some movie. The plot just changed on us.
It was very shocking.
Authorities later learned that Norby had been working with this man, Jacob Kinn. He had previously been arrested for child pornography and soon became the #1 suspect.
Melissa had communicated to Jacob Kinn that they did do a staged abduction, that he would have to hurt her to make it look like she was assaulted so that the police would believe that she was a victim as well and that a stranger had abducted this girl.
Obviously, Melissa didn't consent to her death. He put that twist in there on his own. Jacob Kinn wanted the little girl for himself, and his avenue to do that was through Melissa Nordby. It was just another chapter in Jacob Kinn's sick mind.
This mother trusted her with her child, and she took total advantage of that and betrayed it because she wanted to have a relationship with someone who obviously did not value her.
It just didn't make sense to me. The Melissa that I knew was loving, caring, protective, and then you find out that she actually helped plan this, and I don't get how a mother can do that.
As a police officer, I see victims of domestic abuse. Victims are manipulated in a way that preys on their self-worth. He made her feel so inadequate that she allowed him to abuse her family friend. She went to some pretty disgusting lengths to feel loved by somebody.
He should be in prison for the rest of his life.
As far as I'm concerned, I don't know if Jacob Kinn could be sentenced for long enough. But that plea deal kept the little girl from having to get up on the stand and testify and relive what happened.
Today, my daughter, she's thriving. She's stubborn. She's pushy and bossy. She is a normal 11-year-old child.
See, she's trying to get on my head.
Where'd she go?
She's over here.
She is amazing. Definitely my strength.
This case is a career case for me. It's had a big impact in my life.
This interview, looking back at it now, I realize how important it was.
You see that lake right there?
Jacob was hard to interview because it was hard to play to his emotions.
I wasn't there. I didn't do anything to her, and I haven't seen her.
He controlled the interview so much with his defensive responses to our questions, yet the longer he talked,
Yeah, I wasn't in Big Fort.
the closer we got to recovering her. Every word out of his mouth was a piece of evidence.
I had no reason to be in Big Fort.
The fact that we were able to recover her alive is nothing but amazing.
This, I think, will forever be the #1 case that I've ever worked on, just because we were able to bring her home, you know. We got her back.
Today, if you go out to Big Fork, Minnesota, where we process the camper scene, you can still see the camper tucked back into the woods. Pretty disturbing.
To look at the vastness of the area in and around Big Fork and to find this little camper, it was basically a needle in a haystack. Just never would have believed it.
We go into law enforcement to help people and to put bad people away. To be able to do both in the same day, it was a really good feeling.
There was no apology from Kin in court, the judge sentencing him to 52 years in prison.
Everybody that helped bring her home, thank you so much. You guys are my heroes. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have her today.
On the evening of December 11, 1978, the winter air over Des Plaines, Illinois, carried the kind of cold that settled deep inside the lungs. Christmas lights flickered weakly across quiet suburban streets, while families sat inside warm kitchens finishing dinner, unaware that beneath one modest ranch house less than 30 miles from downtown Chicago, death had been waiting for years. Snow from the previous week still clung to the edges of sidewalks in dirty gray piles. The neighborhood looked ordinary in the way American suburbs often do at night. Still lawns, glowing windows, parked cars dusted with frost, and television light moving behind curtains. Nothing about the street suggested horror. Nothing suggested that dozens of boys had vanished into that house and never returned. Inside the home on West Summerdale Avenue, John Wayne Gacy moved with the calm confidence of a man who believed he had escaped suspicion his entire life. He laughed loudly when he wanted to charm people. He shook hands firmly. He wore expensive clothes, attended community events, and spoke like a hard-working businessman. Neighbors knew him as energetic and sociable, the type of man who always seemed to have a story to tell. Some remembered seeing him dressed as a clown at charity functions, painting smiles across children's faces while parents applauded. They saw a successful contractor, a politically connected citizen, a man active in local events. They did not see the darkness buried under his floorboards. But darkness leaves traces. It lingers in smells that refuse to disappear. It hides in nervous glances, in stories that change too often, in the sudden silence left behind when a teenage boy never comes home. By the winter of 1978, the trail surrounding Gacy had already become crowded with ghosts. Young men had vanished across the Chicago area for years. Some were runaways. Some had drifted from broken homes. Some had simply disappeared after telling friends they were going to meet someone for work. Their photographs slowly faded on police bulletin boards while parents waited beside telephones that never rang. Then came 15-year-old Robert Piest. Robert was young, ambitious, and restless in the way many teenagers are. He worked part-time at a pharmacy and dreamed about the future with the impatience of someone who believed life was just beginning. On the night he disappeared, he told his mother he was stepping out briefly to speak with a contractor about a possible job opportunity. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Robert never returned home. At first, his disappearance seemed like countless others. A missing teenager. A delayed curfew. A misunderstanding. Yet something about the case immediately felt wrong. Robert was dependable. Responsible. He was not known for running away. His mother felt it before investigators did. Parents often speak about instinct as though it is something supernatural, but usually it is simply the terror of knowing their child too well. She understood that her son would not vanish willingly. Detectives began tracing Robert's final known movements, and the path led directly toward Gacy. The moment investigators entered his orbit, the atmosphere shifted. Gacy appeared cooperative at first. He smiled easily and answered questions with rehearsed confidence. He talked too much, the way nervous men often do when trying to appear relaxed. He explained where he had been, what he had done, who he had seen. His words flowed smoothly, yet detectives noticed something unsettling beneath the performance. His eyes rarely rested. His stories bent at the edges. Certain details changed when repeated. The room around him seemed heavy with tension, though nobody could yet explain why. Then there was the smell. Several investigators later described it as thick, sour, unforgettable. Gacy blamed it on saw problems beneath the house. It was a practical explanation, almost believable, but the odor stayed in their minds long after they left. Human instinct notices decay even when logic attempts to dismiss it. One detective reportedly walked through the home feeling as though the walls themselves were concealing something alive and terrible. As police dug deeper, fragments of a horrifying pattern began to emerge. Gacy had employed teenage boys through his construction company. Many of those boys had passed briefly through his life, before disappearing from everyone else's. Some families remembered their sons mentioning him casually at dinner tables months earlier. A contractor offering extra work. Easy money. Late-night shifts. Nothing alarming on the surface. Yet when investigators laid the names side by side, the coincidences became impossible to ignore. The image of John Wayne Gacy slowly cracked apart. Behind the cheerful public mask was a predator who hunted with patience. He searched for vulnerability the way experienced fishermen read water. Some victims came from unstable homes. Some needed jobs. Some trusted too easily. Gacy understood how to appear safe. He understood the power of normalcy. That was what made him terrifying. Monsters are easier to fear when they look monstrous. Gacy looked like someone invited to neighborhood barbecues. And perhaps most disturbing of all was the clown persona. Photographs later recovered from his home showed him smiling beneath thick makeup as Pogo the Clown. Bright colors stretched across his face while children stood nearby laughing. Looking at those images after the murders became public felt almost unreal to investigators. The painted smile appeared frozen, artificial, hollow. People across America stared at those photographs and felt a primitive kind of unease rise inside them. Clowns had once belonged to birthday parties and circuses. After Gacy, they belonged to nightmares too. As surveillance around Gacy intensified, detectives noticed strange behavior. He drank heavily. He spoke compulsively. At times he appeared arrogant, convinced he could outsmart everyone around him. At other moments he seemed exhausted, as though years of secrets were beginning to rot him from within. Investigators followed him through icy Chicago streets, while pressure mounted behind closed police station doors. Every passing hour increased the possibility that Robert Piest might still be alive somewhere. But underneath that house, time had already stopped. The crawl space beneath Gacy's home was small and damp, packed with earth and darkness. Pipes ran overhead. Mud clung to the ground. It was not a place built for human remains, yet over the years Gacy transformed it into a graveyard. He buried bodies in rows beneath the home where he slept, ate dinner, entertained guests, and celebrated holidays. The dead rested only feet away from ordinary suburban life. Families drove past the property every day without imagining what lay underground. The contrast between normal life and hidden evil became one of the defining horrors of the case. America in the late 1970s was still holding tightly to the illusion that danger existed somewhere else, somewhere visible. Evil belonged in abandoned alleyways or distant cities. It did not belong inside neat neighborhoods with trimmed lawns and community events. Gacy shattered that illusion completely. Long before the full truth emerged, fear had already begun spreading quietly through Des Plaines. Detectives parked outside the house for hours. Neighbors watched through curtains. Rumors drifted between diners, grocery stores, and bars. Some residents refused to believe the accusations. Others suddenly remembered moments that now felt sinister in retrospect: teenage boys arriving late at night, strange sounds, Gacy's unsettling intensity when conversations turned personal. Meanwhile, the families of missing young men lived suspended between hope and dread. For years many had searched without answers. Some blamed themselves. Some blamed police. Some held onto impossible fantasies that their sons had simply started new lives elsewhere. None were prepared for the scale of what investigators were about to uncover. Because this was not the story of one murder. It was the story of 33. 33 young lives swallowed by a man who learned how to disguise brutality beneath charm. 33 futures erased beneath the floor of a suburban home while the killer attended parties, shook hands with politicians, and performed magic tricks for children. America had seen serial killers before, but John Wayne Gacy represented something colder and more disturbing. He embodied the terrifying possibility that evil could live comfortably among ordinary people for years without detection. And on that freezing December night in 1978, as police closed in around the house on West Somerdale Avenue, the carefully constructed world of John Wayne Gacy was beginning to collapse. The smell beneath the floorboards was no longer just a smell. The missing boys were no longer isolated cases. The smiling clown was no longer simply a performer in grease paint. He was becoming one of the most feared killers in American history. Within days, investigators would crawl beneath the house carrying flashlights and handkerchiefs pressed against their faces. What they uncovered there would horrify even veteran officers. Buried in the soil were bodies wrapped in plastic, packed into shallow graves like objects. Some victims were so badly decomposed that identification seemed impossible. Yet each body represented a son, a brother, a teenager whose voice had once filled a home. And above them all, Gacy had continued smiling for years. Chicago in the 1970s was a city caught between ambition and decay. The skyline still carried the proud steel silhouette of American industry, but beneath the towering buildings and busy freeways, entire neighborhoods were beginning to change. Factories closed without warning. Working-class families struggled to stay afloat. Young people drifted through uncertain futures while the city wrestled with rising crime, political corruption, and fear that seemed to grow heavier every winter. It was a place where loneliness could disappear into crowded streets, where runaways could vanish without headlines, and where a man like John Wayne Gacy could hide in plain sight for years. The northwest suburbs beyond downtown Chicago looked quieter, safer, almost insulated from the chaos of the city. Streets stretched through rows of modest homes with trimmed lawns and parked station wagons. Children rode bicycles during the summer while neighbors waved to each other across driveways. The smell of cut grass mixed with cigarette smoke drifting from open garages. At night, porch lights glowed softly against the Midwestern dark. It was the kind of environment Americans associated with stability. Families believed they had escaped the dangers of urban life by moving there. Des Plaines and Norwood Park embodied that illusion perfectly. Men woke before sunrise to drive into the city for work, while women prepared lunches in warm kitchens. Teenagers gathered at diners after school, laughing over milkshakes and cheap hamburgers beneath neon signs buzzing in the cold air. Churches filled on Sundays. Little league games occupied summer afternoons. People trusted familiar faces. They trusted the smiling contractor, who attended community events and shook hands confidently at local gatherings. John Wayne Gacy understood that trust better than anyone. Long before the murders became public, Gacy had spent years carefully building the image of a successful American man. He knew how to imitate respectability with frightening precision. He wore polished shoes, drove nice cars, and spoke with loud confidence. To many people, he seemed energetic, ambitious, even generous. He owned a construction business called PDM Contractors, and employed young men for labor projects around the Chicago area. He entertained guests at his home. He involved himself in local politics. He posed for photographs beside influential people with the broad grin of someone desperate to belong among them. But beneath that performance lived a man shaped by humiliation, anger, and buried violence. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. His childhood home was tense, suffocating, and unpredictable. His father, an alcoholic mechanic, ruled the household through intimidation and cruelty. Friends and relatives later described the older Gacy as violent and emotionally abusive, particularly toward his son. Young John desperately wanted approval from a man who seemed incapable of giving affection. Instead, he received insults, beatings, and constant reminders that he was weak. The emotional scars followed him into adulthood. As a child, Gacy struggled with health problems, including heart issues that left him isolated from other boys his age. While children outside played sports and roughhoused in the streets, he often remained indoors feeling physically fragile and socially awkward. He learned early how to perform for acceptance. He told stories. He exaggerated achievements. He tried to make people laugh. Somewhere inside him, the line between genuine personality and manufactured identity began to blur. By his 20s, Gacy appeared determined to reinvent himself entirely. He married young and briefly seemed to achieve the life he always wanted. He worked hard, became active in civic organizations, and projected the image of a reliable family man climbing steadily toward success. To outsiders, he looked ambitious and charismatic. Yet beneath the surface, disturbing impulses were already emerging. In 1968, Gacy was convicted in Iowa for sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He was sentenced to prison, where the mask of respectability temporarily collapsed. But even prison failed to stop him. Gacy served only part of his sentence before being released. Astonishingly, he returned to society and began rebuilding his life almost immediately. He remarried, moved back to the Chicago area, and launched his contracting business. Few people around him understood the full truth of his criminal past. In an era before digital databases and instant background checks, secrets remained easier to bury. Communities trusted appearances. And Gacy excelled at appearances. The house on West Summerdale Avenue became the center of that carefully constructed world. It was an ordinary ranch-style home tucked inside a quiet neighborhood. Nothing about it appeared threatening. Inside, Gacy hosted parties and social gatherings. He cooked meals for friends. He joked loudly and entertained guests with stories. Contractors and employees came and went frequently. Music played. Beer bottles collected in kitchens during late-night conversations. The atmosphere often felt chaotic, but welcoming. And beneath the floorboards, bodies slowly accumulated. The duality of Gacy's existence became one of the most horrifying aspects of the case. During the day he negotiated business deals and socialized with neighbors. At night he prowled for victims. He moved between these identities with terrifying ease, almost as though he believed one version of himself cancelled out the other. Psychologists later studied his behavior extensively, trying to understand how someone could compartmentalize evil so completely. Neighbors remembered him as talkative, sometimes overbearing, but rarely frightening. He enjoyed attention. He inserted himself into conversations loudly, often dominating rooms with forced humor and exaggerated confidence. Some found him annoying. Others genuinely liked him. Very few suspected what he was capable of. Then there was the clown persona. Gacy performed under the names Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, dressing in colorful costumes and thick makeup for community events, charitable functions, and children's parties. The image became infamous after his arrest, but at the time many people saw it as harmless entertainment. Clowns represented joy in American culture. They belonged at circuses and birthday parties, symbols of laughter and innocence. Yet something about Gacy's clown makeup unsettled people even before the murders became public. Photographs from the era show him smiling unnaturally wide beneath layers of grease paint, his eyes dark and strangely detached behind the performance. The costume looked cheerful at first glance, but the longer people stared at the pictures, the more artificial the smile appeared. After his crimes were exposed, those images transformed into cultural symbols of hidden monstrosity. Parents who once welcomed clowns into children's parties suddenly looked at them differently. Still, the true horror was not the costume. It was the trust. Gacy understood how society viewed young men in the 1970s, especially teenagers drifting between jobs, unstable homes, and uncertain futures. Many victims came from vulnerable backgrounds. Some were hitchhikers. Some struggled with family problems. Some simply wanted quick cash from construction work. In that era, missing teenage boys rarely generated the same urgency as missing children from affluent neighborhoods. Police often assumed they had run away voluntarily. Gacy exploited that assumption repeatedly. He recruited young men through his business, or approached them casually with offers of work. Sometimes he promised easy money for helping with construction projects. Other times he simply invited them over for food, drinks, or conversation. Survivors later described his ability to shift personalities rapidly. He could appear friendly one moment and deeply unsettling the next. There was often alcohol involved. Sometimes drugs. Then came the handcuffs. Gacy reportedly enjoyed showing victims a magic trick. He would place handcuffs on himself, escape them, then challenge the other person to try. Once the cuffs clicked shut around a victim's wrists, the atmosphere changed completely. The performance ended. Panic began. Inside the house, ordinary suburban sounds continued above unimaginable violence. Television programs played in living rooms while trains rumbled faintly through distant Chicago neighborhoods. Snow fell outside during winter nights as Gacy assaulted and tortured young men only feet away from the rooms where guests had once laughed during parties. The contrast felt impossible to comprehend. Yet for years, nobody stopped him. Part of that failure came from the limitations of law enforcement during the time. Missing persons cases were fragmented across jurisdictions. Communication between departments moved slowly. DNA technology did not yet exist in the form investigators rely upon today. Young men disappearing separately across the Chicago area did not immediately suggest a serial predator. Each case floated independently through police systems already overwhelmed with crime. Families suffered in silence. Mothers kept porch lights burning late into the night, hoping sons would return home unexpectedly. Fathers searched neighborhoods and bus stations. Brothers and sisters stared at empty chairs during holidays. Some parents called police repeatedly only to hear the same painful assumption: he probably ran away. Meanwhile, Gacy continued attending barbecues and political events. The social climate of the 1970s also played a role in his ability to hide. America was enduring cultural upheaval. Distrust of institutions had grown after Vietnam and Watergate. Crime rates climbed nationally. Communities struggled to adapt to changing ideas about sexuality, youth culture, and authority. Within that confusion, vulnerable young men often slipped through cracks unnoticed. Gacy thrived in those cracks. The neighborhood around West Somerdale Avenue eventually became a landscape haunted by hindsight. After the investigation exploded into national headlines, residents replayed old memories endlessly. Strange odors drifting from the house during humid summers. Young men arriving late at night. Gacy digging beneath his home. Moments that once seemed odd suddenly became unbearable in retrospect. But before December 1978, those details remained scattered pieces without context. The illusion of safety still held. Christmas decorations appeared across suburban lawns while families shopped for presents in crowded department stores downtown. Snowstorms swept across Illinois highways. Radios played holiday music while John Wayne Gacy carried secrets beneath his home that were already beginning to rot through the foundations of his carefully crafted life. And somewhere in that growing darkness, the disappearance of one teenage boy was about to force investigators into the nightmare hidden beneath suburban America. Robert Piest was 15 years old, but in the quiet, ordinary way of Midwestern adolescence, he often seemed older in responsibility than in years. He lived in Des Plaines, Illinois, a suburban town where life was measured in school schedules, part-time shifts, and family routines that repeated with comforting predictability. His home was not wealthy, but it was stable in the ways that mattered most. Meals were eaten together when possible. Conversations still happened across kitchen tables. Expectations were clear, even if the world outside sometimes felt uncertain. Robert was not a boy who drifted aimlessly. He had direction, even if it was still forming. He worked at Nissen Pharmacy, a local drugstore where the fluorescent lighting hummed softly over polished floors and neatly arranged shelves. The job was simple, but it gave him something many teenagers wanted more than anything else: independence. A paycheck meant possibility. A paycheck meant choices. Robert liked that feeling. He liked being able to contribute, to save money, to think about what came next. Those who knew him described him as responsible, polite, and quietly ambitious. He was the kind of teenager who showed up on time without being reminded, who followed instructions carefully, who treated adults with a level of respect that felt natural rather than forced. There was a steadiness to him that made parents trust him and employers value him. He was not reckless. He was not impulsive. He did not vanish into trouble or rebellion. He stayed close to home, close to routine, close to the familiar structure of his life. Yet even stable lives carry moments of change. In December of 1978, the holiday season had already begun to settle over Des Plaines. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the metallic bite of early winter. Storefront windows were decorated with red and green displays. People moved faster through parking lots, heads lowered against the wind. Inside homes, conversations often revolved around upcoming celebrations, school breaks, and family gatherings. For Robert, it was also a time of small personal momentum. He was thinking about the future, about work, about earning more, about what might come after high school. It was in this atmosphere that John Wayne Gacy entered his life. Robert had been told that a contractor was looking for young help with possible construction work. The opportunity sounded simple enough: extra money, flexible hours, no complicated commitment. For a teenager already accustomed to responsibility, it did not seem unusual. Many young people in the area picked up similar jobs. It was the kind of chance that appeared and disappeared quickly, rarely questioned in depth. When Robert mentioned the possibility of meeting the contractor, there was no alarm in his voice. No instinctive warning that something was wrong. Just the practical curiosity of someone considering work. His mother, Catherine Piest, later remembered that moment with painful clarity. It was not dramatic. It was not marked by fear. It was ordinary. The kind of ordinary that only later becomes unbearable in hindsight. On the evening of December 11th, Robert left the pharmacy after finishing his shift. The store smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper bags, the kind of sterile cleanliness that lingered after hours of customer traffic. He told co-workers he was stepping out briefly to speak with the contractor, who had been asking about him. He would not be long. He might even return that same evening. He never came back. At first, there was no immediate panic. Teenagers sometimes lost track of time. Plans changed. Friends got distracted. But as the night stretched on and the hours passed without a phone call or appearance, unease began to settle in. Catherine Piest felt it first in a way that was difficult to explain later. It was not logic. It was absence. Something in the rhythm of her son's presence had been interrupted. By the next morning, concern had deepened into certainty that something was wrong. Robert was not the kind of boy who simply stayed out without contact. He did not disappear from responsibility. He did not abandon his job without explanation. When attempts to reach him failed, the family contacted authorities. The case began quietly, like many missing person reports do. A name. A description. A timeline. A photograph placed into a system already carrying too many others. But this case would not remain quiet for long. As investigators began tracing Robert's last known movements, the path led to a name that was already familiar in other, smaller investigations around the area: John Wayne Gacy. A contractor. A businessman. A man who employed young workers. A man who had interacted with multiple teenagers, who had since vanished under similar circumstances. When police first contacted Gacy, he did not appear concerned. He presented himself as cooperative, almost annoyed by the inconvenience. He spoke about Robert with casual familiarity, as though recalling a routine interaction. His tone suggested nothing unusual had occurred. He offered explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, yet lacked emotional depth. It was as if he was describing someone who had briefly passed through his day rather than a missing child whose family was desperate for answers. But beneath that surface, investigators began to notice inconsistencies. Details shifted slightly each time Gacy repeated them. His timeline contained gaps that felt too convenient. His explanations were structured in a way that seemed rehearsed, yet imperfectly so, like a story built quickly and adjusted under pressure. Most unsettling was the contrast between his calm demeanor and the urgency of the situation. Robert Piest was missing. A 15-year-old boy had vanished after meeting him. Yet Gacy behaved as though he was simply part of an administrative misunderstanding. While detectives followed procedural leads, Catherine Piest lived in a state of suspended fear. She retraced her son's final hours again and again in her mind. She imagined him walking out of the pharmacy. She imagined him crossing streets under cold streetlights. She imagined the moment he might have met the contractor. Each version of events ended in silence. Each possibility led further into uncertainty. Parents of missing children often describe time differently. Hours lose structure. Sleep becomes fragmented. The world continues functioning around them while their internal reality remains stuck at the moment everything changed. Catherine called hospitals, friends, co-workers, anyone who might have seen him. Each conversation ended the same way: no, they had not seen him. As pressure increased, investigators began focusing more closely on Gacy's behavior and movements. They learned that Robert had been last seen entering Gacy's orbit voluntarily, believing he was meeting someone about work. That detail was significant. It meant trust had been involved. It meant there had been no obvious struggle in public. Whatever happened next likely occurred behind closed doors, away from witnesses. The realization deepened the urgency of the investigation. Inside the police station, detectives began connecting Robert's disappearance to other missing young men in the region. Patterns began to emerge slowly, like fragments of a larger picture assembling itself under dim light. Similar ages. Similar backgrounds. Similar last known contacts. Many of them had been seen with the same man, John Wayne Gacy. Yet even with growing suspicion, there was still no physical evidence. No body. No definitive proof of what had happened. In cases like this, time becomes both enemy and ally. The longer a person remains missing, the more difficult recovery becomes. But pressure also builds, forcing deeper investigation into places that might otherwise remain untouched. That pressure eventually led investigators to Gacy's home. For Catherine Piest, the waiting became unbearable. Each passing day stretched like an empty corridor with no end. Hope and dread existed simultaneously, pulling in opposite directions. She clung to the possibility that her son might still be found alive somewhere, even as instinct told her otherwise. She did not yet know that beneath a suburban house, the truth was already waiting. Robert Piest's story, like the stories of so many others connected to John Wayne Gacy, represents more than a single disappearance. It represents the vulnerability of trust, the fragility of routine, and the terrifying ease with which ordinary moments can shift into irreversible loss. A brief walk out of a pharmacy. A conversation about work. A meeting that seemed harmless. These are the small intersections where lives can be altered forever without warning. At the center of it all was a boy who believed in normal life. A boy who expected to return home after a short conversation. A boy whose absence would ultimately unravel one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. And as investigators moved closer to the house on West Somerdale Avenue, they were not yet aware that Robert's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy, but the key that would unlock a hidden graveyard beneath the foundations of an entire community. The night Robert Piest disappeared did not end like a crime scene. It ended like a question mark hanging over an entire community, growing heavier with each passing hour. At first, there was still space for doubt, for the possibility of misunderstanding, for the fragile hope that he had simply gone somewhere unexpected. But that space disappeared quickly as investigators began to trace the fragile thread of his last known movements. What they uncovered was not a chaotic accident, or a teenage disappearance without explanation. It was a path that led directly into the orbit of a man who had spent years hiding in plain sight. John Wayne Gacy became the center of attention almost immediately once Robert's connection to him was confirmed. Detectives returned to Nissen Pharmacy, speaking with co-workers who remembered Robert's final shift. The details were small but consistent. He had been calm, focused, normal. He had mentioned the meeting with a contractor without hesitation, as if it were just another small step in a working teenager's routine life. There was no sign of fear. No sign of suspicion. Only the ordinary trust that young people place in the world before experience teaches caution. From the pharmacy, investigators expanded outward, reconstructing the timeline like pieces of a fragile puzzle. They learned that Robert had been approached by a man offering construction work, someone who seemed credible, someone who spoke with confidence about opportunities and pay. The name that surfaced again and again was Gacy. At first, it was just another lead among many. But unlike other leads, this one did not fade when examined more closely. It deepened. Detectives began speaking with people who had encountered Gacy through his business. Some described him as loud, energetic, almost theatrical in his personality. Others remembered him as unpredictable, switching from friendly conversation to unsettling intensity without warning. There was a duality to him that made people uneasy in hindsight, though few had recognized it at the time. He was a man who seemed to enjoy control over social situations, who filled silence quickly, who dominated attention, as though silence itself made him uncomfortable. As the investigation intensified, Gacy was questioned directly. His demeanor during interviews struck investigators as carefully controlled. He did not appear nervous in the way guilty suspects often do. Instead, he seemed irritated, as though the situation itself was an inconvenience. He spoke about Robert Piest as if describing a fleeting interaction with someone barely worth remembering. His tone lacked emotional weight, but that alone was not evidence. What stood out more was the structure of his responses. They were overly detailed in some areas, yet strangely vague in others, as though certain parts of the story had been deliberately shaped while others were left unexamined. Detectives noticed something else that could not be ignored. Gacy volunteered information too easily in some moments, almost as if trying to appear cooperative. Then, in other moments, he became defensive without clear reason. This inconsistency created a growing sense of discomfort among the investigators. It was not proof of guilt, but it was enough to justify deeper scrutiny. While police worked inside formal procedures, something more instinctive was happening outside of it. The disappearance of a teenage boy connected to a known contractor began to circulate quietly through local networks. Families of other missing young men started to pay attention in ways they had not before. Patterns that once felt unrelated now seemed to align with disturbing clarity. Names that had faded into unresolved case files began to resurface. Each connection pointed back toward Gacy. The investigation soon revealed that Robert was not the first young man to disappear after interacting with him. There were others. Some had been last seen near construction sites. Others had mentioned job opportunities that never materialized. A pattern of vulnerability began to emerge, not in isolation, but in accumulation. Individually, each case might have seemed explainable. Together, they formed something far more disturbing. Yet even with suspicion growing, there was still no physical evidence linking Gacy directly to Robert's fate. That absence created tension within the investigation. Police knew they were circling something serious, but without proof, they were still constrained by procedure. And while they worked through legal limitations, time continued moving forward, quietly eroding any chance of finding Robert alive. Inside the Gacy home, life continued with unsettling normality. Neighbors still saw him coming and going. He still interacted with others in ways that appeared ordinary. He attended social gatherings, spoke with confidence, and maintained the outward appearance of a functioning member of the community. That ability to sustain normalcy while suspicion gathered around him would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. As detectives increased surveillance, they began to notice irregular patterns in Gacy's behavior. He made sudden trips outside his home without clear purpose. He seemed to monitor his surroundings more carefully than before. There were moments when his confidence appeared to fluctuate, as if he were aware that attention was tightening around him. Yet he did not flee. He remained in place, continuing to engage with the world as though nothing had changed. Inside the police department, pressure was mounting. Robert's family demanded answers. Media attention was beginning to build, though not yet at the level it would eventually reach. Every officer involved understood that time was becoming critical. If Robert had survived the initial encounter, his chances were diminishing with each passing day. If he had not, then whatever evidence existed needed to be found before it was lost forever. The investigation reached a turning point when detectives intensified their focus on Gacy's residence. They were no longer simply collecting statements. They were observing behavior, mapping inconsistencies, and searching for anything that could justify a search warrant. The house itself became a focal point of suspicion. Its ordinary exterior contrasted sharply with the unease surrounding its owner. It stood quietly in a suburban neighborhood, indistinguishable from others on the street, yet now carrying an invisible weight. During this period, Gacy continued to speak with investigators, often volunteering statements that seemed intended to redirect suspicion. He expressed frustration at being questioned repeatedly. He emphasized his own business responsibilities. He attempted to present himself as someone unfairly entangled in an overreaction. But beneath those statements, there was a growing tension that even his composure could not fully conceal. What investigators did not yet know was that beneath that house lay evidence far more horrifying than they had imagined. At this stage of the investigation, they were still operating in the world of missing persons, not confirmed homicide. They were still searching for a living teenager who might be found. That possibility, however faint, shaped every decision they made. Meanwhile, Robert Piest's family existed in a different reality entirely. For them, time had collapsed into a cycle of waiting and uncertainty. Each phone call raised hope and fear simultaneously. Each knock at the door carried potential meaning. Catherine Piest lived in a state of constant tension, replaying her son's last moments repeatedly, searching for something she might have missed, something that could change the outcome. But there was nothing to find in memory that could alter what had already been set in motion. As investigators gathered more information, the case against Gacy strengthened in fragments rather than sudden revelation. It was not one dramatic discovery that changed everything. It was accumulation. Small inconsistencies. Witness statements. Behavioral observations. Patterns across multiple missing persons cases. Each piece alone was insufficient. Together, they formed a direction that could no longer be ignored. Still, the truth remained buried, both literally and figuratively. The deeper investigators looked into Gacy's life, the more contradictions they found. He was at once a community figure and a man with a hidden history of criminal behavior. He was someone who could laugh with neighbors one moment and speak about business opportunities with teenagers the next. That ability to shift identities so seamlessly made him difficult to define in simple terms. He was not a man who fit easily into assumptions about criminals. He operated within them, not outside them. As the investigation approached a critical stage, the atmosphere surrounding the case changed. What had begun as a missing person inquiry was now evolving into something much darker. Detectives were no longer asking only where Robert Piest was. They were beginning to ask who John Wayne Gacy really was, and how many others might be connected to him. And in the background of all this growing suspicion, the suburban house on Summerdale Avenue remained unchanged, holding its secrets beneath layers of soil and silence, waiting for the moment when the ground itself would finally be forced to speak. The house on West Summerdale Avenue did not look like a place where something irreversible had happened. It stood with the quiet confidence of suburban architecture in the 1970s, a single-story structure with a simple roofline, a modest driveway, and a front yard that blended into the rest of the neighborhood without resistance. There were no warning signs carved into its exterior. No visible marks of violence. No architectural hints of what lay beneath. To anyone passing by, it was just another home among many, part of the predictable rhythm of Des Plaines' life. But investigators no longer saw it that way. By the time police turned their full attention toward the property, the house had already transformed in their minds from a residence into a possibility. A theory. A location where answers might be buried in the most literal sense. Everything they had gathered about John Wayne Gacy pointed toward it with increasing clarity, yet nothing they had seen so far could confirm what they feared. The investigation had reached a threshold where suspicion alone was no longer enough. The truth had to be physically uncovered. Inside the home, Gacy continued to behave as though nothing was fundamentally wrong. He moved through familiar routines, spoke with a confidence that bordered on defiance, and maintained the structure of daily life that had carried him for years. Yet those observing him closely noticed subtle shifts. There were moments when he seemed to overcompensate with humor. Other times, he grew suddenly quiet, as if measuring the weight of every word before speaking. It was not panic in the conventional sense. It was something more controlled, more internal, like a man adjusting constantly to pressure he refused to acknowledge openly. The house itself became a silent character in the investigation. Detectives who had entered it during interviews remembered details that did not fit together comfortably. The smell, first and most persistent, lingered in their memories. It was not a single identifiable odor, but a mixture that seemed to cling to the air regardless of ventilation. Gacy explained it away with references to plumbing issues beneath the house, but the explanation never fully settled. It remained an unresolved sensation, something the mind returned to without permission. Rooms inside the home appeared ordinary at first glance. Furnishings were typical for the time. There were living spaces where guests had likely once gathered, a kitchen where meals had been prepared, and personal items scattered in ways that suggested normal domestic life. Yet beneath that surface normality, investigators began to feel an underlying dissonance, as if the house contained hidden compartments that did not align with its visible structure. What made the situation more unsettling was the realization that many people had entered this space before without suspicion. Contractors, employees, acquaintances, and guests had all moved through these rooms at different times, unaware that beneath their feet lay something unimaginable. That thought alone began to reshape how investigators viewed every detail. The breakthrough in focus came not from a single revelation, but from the accumulation of suspicion surrounding the crawl space beneath the house. References to digging, construction activity, and unusual soil disturbances began to surface through witness accounts. Gacy's own explanations about work-related modifications to the property seemed increasingly inconsistent when compared with what neighbors recalled seeing. There were moments when he appeared to have excavated areas under the home, without clear structural justification. The crawl space itself was a confined, shadowed area beneath the structure, accessible only through small entry points and difficult to fully inspect without direct physical effort. It was not designed for frequent human presence. Pipes and structural supports ran overhead, and the ground was uneven, compacted earth mixed with debris. In theory, it was just part of the building's foundation. In practice, it was something far more concealed. Investigators began to understand that if anything had been hidden there, it might not have been accidental. It would have required intent, time, and repetition. The kind of sustained behavior that suggested planning rather than impulse. As police worked to secure the legal authority necessary for a deeper search, pressure increased from multiple directions. Robert Piest's disappearance was no longer an isolated case in their files. It had become the focal point of a widening investigation that now included multiple missing young men. Each new connection added urgency. Each similarity increased the sense that they were not dealing with separate incidents, but with a single pattern that had gone unnoticed for years. Inside the police department, discussions grew increasingly focused on what might be found beneath the house. The possibility had shifted from speculation to expectation. Yet even among experienced investigators, there was hesitation. No one wanted to imagine what confirmation might mean. The absence of proof still allowed space for doubt, however small. Once the ground was opened, that space would disappear. For Robert Piest's family, the uncertainty had become unbearable in a different way. Hope and fear no longer existed separately. They overlapped constantly, collapsing into each other until it became difficult to distinguish one from the other. Every passing day, without answers, intensified the emotional strain. Catherine Piest's focus narrowed entirely to the investigation. Her son had left the pharmacy to meet someone for work, and from that moment forward, the world had stopped providing explanations. Meanwhile, Gacy's behavior continued to draw attention for its contradictions. He did not attempt to flee. He did not openly confess, or directly resist investigation efforts. Instead, he maintained a posture of controlled frustration, insisting on his innocence while simultaneously appearing increasingly aware of the pressure closing in around him. This combination of denial and tension made him difficult to interpret. To some observers, he still appeared confident. To others, he seemed like a man carefully managing an internal collapse. The house remained the center of all attention. Surveillance intensified around the property. Officers monitored movements in and out. Every visitor, every interaction, every unusual activity was noted. The neighborhood itself began to change under the weight of that attention. Residents who once passed the house without thought now glanced at it with curiosity and unease. Conversations that once focused on ordinary suburban concerns shifted toward speculation and rumor. Yet despite the growing attention, nothing concrete emerged from the surface. That absence of immediate evidence created a tense waiting period. Investigators knew they were close to something significant, but they could not yet reach it. The situation became a test of patience, procedure, and persistence. Each hour that passed increased the urgency, but also reinforced the need for precision. Acting too quickly risked losing critical evidence. Acting too slowly risked losing time. Within the house, Gacy continued his routine. He spoke with others. He moved through familiar spaces. He maintained the outward appearance of control. But those observing him closely noted that something about his presence had begun to feel more constrained. As though the walls themselves were narrowing around him, even before any physical search had begun. The most disturbing realization emerging at this stage of the investigation was not just what might be hidden beneath the house, but how long it might have remained hidden. Years had passed with no discovery. Dozens of lives had intersected with this location without triggering intervention. That fact alone forced investigators to reconsider assumptions about visibility, awareness, and the limits of perception in ordinary environments. As legal approval for a deeper search moved forward, the focus of the entire case converged on a single physical point beneath the structure. The crawl space was no longer just part of the house. It had become the center of a growing question that could no longer be answered through interviews or reports. It required direct confrontation with what lay below. And in the final hours before that confrontation began, the silence beneath the suburban home remained intact, holding its secrets in place as if aware that they were about to be disturbed for the first time. By the time the investigation reached its sixth stage, the case of Robert Piest had already stopped being just a missing person report. It had expanded into something heavier, something that pressed against every corner of the police department's attention. What began as a single teenage disappearance now carried the weight of multiple unresolved cases, all orbiting around the same unsettling figure, John Wayne Gacy. Yet despite the growing pressure, certainty still remained just out of reach. The investigation was moving forward, but it was moving through fog. Detectives had built a psychological outline of Gacy long before they had physical proof. They described him as controlled, socially adaptable, and capable of maintaining dual identities without visible strain. During the day he could appear as a civic-minded businessman, and at night, according to emerging suspicions, he may have become something far more predatory. But in law enforcement, suspicion alone does not hold weight in court. Every theory had to be grounded in evidence, and at this stage, evidence was still fragmented. Interviews continued across Chicago's northwest suburbs. Investigators spoke with young men who had worked for Gacy's construction company. Many described him in inconsistent ways. Some remembered him as generous and talkative, someone who paid cash quickly and provided opportunities when jobs were scarce. Others recalled moments that felt uncomfortable in hindsight, though they had not fully understood them at the time. There were accounts of sudden mood shifts, of excessive drinking during social gatherings, of jokes that carried a tone that felt slightly off, but was difficult to define. What stood out most, however, was the repetition of similar recruitment patterns. Gacy seemed to prefer young males who were economically vulnerable or socially isolated. Many were teenagers or young adults seeking temporary work. They were easy to approach, easy to convince, and less likely to raise alarm if something felt unusual. This pattern alone did not prove criminal intent, but it created a psychological profile that investigators could no longer ignore. As the scope widened, police began to examine missing persons cases from earlier years. Names accumulated across files that had once been treated as unrelated incidents. Some families had never stopped searching. Others had slowly accepted the absence of answers. But when placed side by side, the similarities became difficult to dismiss. Age ranges overlapped. Time frames aligned with Gacy's business operations. Locations clustered within accessible distances of his home and work sites. A pattern was emerging, not through dramatic revelation, but through accumulation. Despite this, investigators faced a significant obstacle. None of these cases directly tied Gacy to a confirmed crime scene. There were suspicions, behavioral patterns, and circumstantial connections, but no definitive physical evidence. Without that, legal action remained limited. The system required more than intuition, even when intuition felt increasingly reliable. Inside the police department, tension grew. Some officers believed they were close to uncovering a major breakthrough. Others remained cautious, aware of how easily patterns can appear convincing without proving causation. The balance between urgency and restraint became increasingly delicate. Acting too quickly risked compromising the investigation. Waiting too long risked losing evidence that might already be deteriorating. At the center of this uncertainty was the house on West Summerdale Avenue. By now, it had become more than just a location. It was a focus point for every investigative theory. Surveillance reports, witness statements, and behavioral observations all converged there. The crawl space beneath the house, previously just a structural feature, had transformed into the most critical unknown in the entire case. Investigators could no longer avoid the implication that whatever had happened to Robert Piest, and possibly others, might be physically contained within that space. Legal preparations for a deeper search intensified. Warrants required careful justification. Judges needed to be convinced that probable cause existed, not just suspicion. Detectives worked through documentation methodically, compiling statements, timelines, and inconsistencies. Every detail had to be precise. Every assertion had to be defensible. During this period, Gacy remained under close observation. His behavior did not suggest overt panic, but it carried subtle shifts that investigators could not ignore. He appeared more attentive to activity around his property. He engaged less casually with visitors. At times, he seemed to linger near windows or exterior doors for slightly longer than necessary. These were not actions that could be legally interpreted as guilt, but they contributed to the growing psychological weight surrounding him. Meanwhile, Robert Piest's family continued living in a state of suspended reality. Each day without news deepened the emotional strain. The absence of answers created a loop of anticipation and dread that could not be resolved. For them, the investigation was not an abstract procedural process. It was a desperate search for a son who had left home believing he would return shortly. Every delay felt like another layer of distance between hope and certainty. As investigators expanded their focus, they began coordinating with multiple agencies. The possibility that other missing persons cases were connected introduced a broader urgency. If Gacy was responsible for more than one disappearance, then time was not only critical for Robert Piest, but potentially for establishing a wider pattern of crimes that might have gone unnoticed for years. Still, the most pressing question remained unanswered. What exactly lay beneath the house? To approach that question, investigators needed to understand the physical structure of the property in detail. They studied architectural layouts, soil conditions, and accessibility points. The crawl space, in particular, became a subject of intense focus. It was small, poorly lit, and difficult to navigate. Any excavation or concealment activity in such a confined area would require deliberate effort. That realization shifted the investigation from abstract suspicion toward something more grounded in physical possibility. Witness accounts from neighbors added another layer of complexity. Some recalled seeing Gacy digging near the property at various times. Others remembered construction-related activity that seemed inconsistent with normal maintenance. None of these observations were conclusive on their own, but together they suggested that the ground beneath the house may have been altered repeatedly over time. Despite growing suspicion, investigators remained constrained by procedure. The threshold for entering a private residence with intent to excavate was high. Authorities had to ensure that every legal requirement was satisfied before taking such a step. This cautious approach reflected both the seriousness of the situation and the potential consequences of acting without sufficient justification. During this waiting period, the psychological tension surrounding the case intensified. Officers involved in the investigation described a sense of anticipation that was difficult to separate from apprehension. They were preparing to confront something unknown, yet strongly suspected to be deeply disturbing. The uncertainty itself became a kind of pressure, shaping every discussion and decision. Gacy, still living in the house under observation, continued to project a carefully maintained exterior. He interacted with investigators when required, answered questions with controlled patience, and maintained his position of denial. Yet those observing him closely noted that his confidence no longer felt entirely stable. There were moments when his responses seemed slightly delayed, as though he was calculating each word before speaking. Outside the house, the neighborhood remained tense but quiet. Residents had begun to sense that something significant was unfolding, though details remained unclear. The presence of law enforcement created an atmosphere that was difficult to ignore. Even routine activities felt altered by proximity to an active investigation. Conversations became more cautious. Observations more frequent. The house that had once blended into the background now stood at the center of collective attention. As legal approval for excavation neared completion, investigators prepared for what would likely become one of the most significant discoveries in the history of the case. Yet even in those final hours before action, there was still no certainty about what would be found. Every theory remained provisional. Every expectation remained vulnerable to surprise. What investigators did not yet know was that beneath the surface of that ordinary suburban home lay evidence that would not only confirm their suspicions, but redefine the entire scope of the investigation. But at this stage, standing at the edge of that discovery, all they had were patterns, inconsistencies, and a growing sense that the ground itself was about to reveal the truth it had been holding for years. The turning point in the investigation did not arrive with a dramatic confession or a sudden collapse of resistance. It arrived through pressure, accumulation, and the quiet force of persistence that had been building for weeks around John Wayne Gacy. By early December 1978, investigators were no longer operating in the realm of isolated suspicion. They were working within a narrowing corridor of probability that pointed increasingly toward a single physical location. Every lead, every statement, every inconsistency had begun to converge on the house at West Somerdale Avenue. Yet even as certainty grew in private discussions, the legal system required patience. Probable cause had to be established with precision. Judges needed more than intuition or pattern recognition. They needed articulated facts that could justify an intrusion into private property. Detectives worked through documentation with meticulous attention, assembling timelines that connected Robert Piest's disappearance to Gacy's last known interactions with him. Each piece of evidence, no matter how small, became part of a larger argument that had to withstand scrutiny. The breakthrough began forming not from a single discovery, but from the alignment of multiple investigative threads. Witness testimonies placed Robert Piest in direct contact with Gacy shortly before his disappearance. Employment records confirmed Gacy's pattern of hiring young men under informal arrangements. Previous missing persons cases, once treated as unrelated, now displayed overlapping behavioral and geographic patterns. None of these elements alone were definitive, but together they created a framework that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Inside the police department, tension intensified. Officers involved in the case understood that they were approaching a critical threshold. They were no longer simply searching for a missing teenager. They were preparing to confront the possibility of multiple homicides. That shift in expectation changed the emotional weight of every decision. Procedures that once felt routine now carried moral gravity. Every step forward implied consequences that extended far beyond a single case file. John Wayne Gacy, meanwhile, remained under surveillance, but not under formal arrest. This created a delicate balance for investigators. They needed to maintain proximity, without alerting him to the full extent of their suspicions. Gacy continued to move through his routines, though observers noted increasing signs of internal pressure. His interactions became more controlled, his humor more forced, his responses more calculated. He was still functioning socially, but something beneath that performance appeared strained. The house itself became the focal point of all investigative energy. By this stage, it was no longer just a residence. It was a potential crime scene that had not yet been exposed. The crawl space beneath, it had shifted from a structural detail into a primary target of inquiry. Investigators had studied its dimensions, accessibility, and history of use. The more they learned, the more it seemed likely that if evidence existed, it would be found there. Securing a search warrant for excavation required careful legal articulation. Detectives compiled affidavits that detailed inconsistencies in Gacy's statements, witness accounts of suspicious behavior, and the broader pattern of missing young men connected to him. Each paragraph of documentation had to be structured to withstand judicial examination. The goal was not to assume guilt, but to demonstrate that sufficient cause existed to justify physical investigation beneath the property. During this preparation, Robert Piest's case remained the emotional anchor of the investigation. He was the reason urgency existed. He was the name that transformed suspicion into action. His disappearance had not only revealed a possible suspect, but had opened a door into a wider pattern that investigators could no longer ignore. His family continued to wait, caught in a space between hope and fear that had become increasingly unbearable. When legal approval was finally granted, it marked a shift from investigation to intervention. The permission to search beneath the house represented more than procedural success. It represented acknowledgement that something hidden might exist there. Officers prepared equipment, coordinated teams, and established protocols for what would likely be a difficult and emotionally taxing process. On the day of the search, the atmosphere around the property changed noticeably. The presence of law enforcement became more concentrated, more deliberate. Neighbors watched with a mixture of curiosity and unease as activity increased around the house. What had once been speculation was now becoming action. The abstract possibility of hidden evidence was about to be tested against physical reality. Gacy was present during the early stages of this transition. His behavior, as observed by investigators, remained controlled but increasingly tense. He asked questions about procedures. He made comments that suggested irritation with the disruption. At times, he attempted to assert authority over the situation, emphasizing his rights as a property owner. Yet beneath that outward posture, there appeared to be a growing awareness that the situation was shifting beyond his control. Inside the house, officers moved methodically. The environment that had once been observed from a distance was now being examined in detail. Floors, walls, and structural elements were reassessed not as domestic features, but as potential concealment points. The crawl space, in particular, drew focused attention. Its confined nature required careful physical entry, and its condition suggested limited recent disturbance in visible areas, though that alone did not rule out hidden activity beneath the surface. As the search preparation intensified, the psychological weight of the moment became increasingly apparent to everyone involved. Officers understood that what lay beneath the house could fundamentally alter the trajectory of the investigation. Yet until physical evidence was uncovered, uncertainty still remained. That uncertainty created a tense space between expectation and confirmation. Outside, the neighborhood continued to watch. The presence of law enforcement had become impossible to ignore. Residents gathered in small clusters, speaking quietly, observing changes in activity patterns around the property. The house that had once been just another structure on a quiet street now occupied a central place in collective attention. It had become a symbol of unanswered questions. Within the investigation team, discussions became more focused and direct. There was no longer debate about whether something significant might be found. The conversation had shifted toward how to handle what might be discovered. Contingency plans were reviewed. Procedures for evidence preservation were reinforced. Every detail mattered, because the scale of what they suspected could not afford procedural failure. At the same time, investigators remained aware of the limitations of expectation. They had not yet seen what lay beneath the ground. The possibility still existed, however remote, that nothing would be found. That awareness kept the investigation grounded, even as anticipation grew. John Wayne Gacy, still under observation, appeared increasingly aware that attention was no longer shifting away from him. While he had not yet been formally charged with murder, the intensity of the investigation surrounding his property suggested that investigators were moving toward a conclusion that had not yet been publicly stated. His responses during interactions became more guarded, less expansive. The ease with which he once spoke seemed diminished. For Robert Piest's family, the waiting had entered a final stage of emotional exhaustion. Every delay now felt like an extension of uncertainty that had already lasted too long. The possibility of resolution, whether hopeful or tragic, had become the only remaining source of stability. Not knowing had become its own form of suffering. As preparations reached completion, the investigation stood at the edge of transformation. Everything up to this point had been leading toward a single act, the physical examination of what lay beneath the house. The accumulation of suspicion, the patterns across cases, the behavioral inconsistencies, and the legal groundwork had all converged on this moment. What would follow would no longer be speculation. It would be discovery. The moment the search beneath the house began, time seemed to lose its usual rhythm. What had once been an ordinary suburban property was now an active excavation site, transformed by legal authority and investigative urgency into something far heavier in meaning. Officers moved with careful coordination, not with the rush of panic, but with the controlled precision of people who understood that what they were about to uncover could reshape everything they thought they knew about the case of John Wayne Gacy. The crawl space beneath the house was small, cramped, and difficult to navigate. It required officers to work in limited visibility, using tools to carefully remove layers of compacted soil. The ground was not uniform. It resisted in uneven ways, as if parts of it had been disturbed and replaced at different times. That alone was enough to heighten suspicion. The soil did not behave like untouched earth beneath a residential structure. It carried irregularities that suggested repeated intervention. As investigators began to dig deeper, the atmosphere within the space changed. What had been an abstract theory slowly began to take physical form. At first, there were no clear indicators. Only the slow, methodical removal of dirt, layer by layer, revealing nothing immediately definitive. But the absence of immediate discovery did not reduce tension. Instead, it stretched it further, creating a silence filled with expectation. Then came the first unmistakable sign that something was wrong. The soil in one section of the crawl space began to shift differently under excavation. It was softer, less compact, as though it had been intentionally disturbed and refilled. Officers working in that area slowed their movements, adjusting their approach with heightened caution. Every movement now carried significance. Every handful of soil removed felt like a step closer to something irreversible. As digging continued, fragments began to appear that did not belong in natural ground. At first, they were small and indistinct. Then they became clearer. Pieces of material, synthetic remnants, and signs of decomposition that confirmed the worst suspicions forming in the minds of investigators. The realization spread gradually, not as a sudden shock, but as an accumulating understanding that the space beneath the house had been used for concealment far beyond anything previously confirmed. When the first human remains were uncovered, the emotional weight in the space shifted completely. There was no dramatic reaction, no chaos, only a profound and immediate recognition that the investigation had crossed a threshold. What had been a missing persons case, then a suspected serial investigation, was now undeniably a recovery operation involving human victims. The discovery did not stop at one set of remains. As excavation continued, more evidence emerged beneath the surface. The crawl space revealed itself not as a single burial point, but as part of a broader pattern of concealment. Each new discovery reinforced the understanding that this was not an isolated incident. The scale of what lay beneath the house began to expand in real time, forcing investigators to confront the reality that they were dealing with multiple victims, each hidden deliberately within the same confined area. Outside the house, the news of the discovery began to spread rapidly among those present. Law enforcement personnel, forensic teams, and supporting officers all became aware that the investigation had shifted into a new phase. The emotional impact was immediate but controlled. Procedures still had to be followed. Evidence still had to be preserved. Yet beneath that procedural discipline, there was an unmistakable sense that something profound had been revealed. John Wayne Gacy, who had been present during the early stages of the search, was now under increasing scrutiny. His behavior changed noticeably as the excavation progressed. The controlled confidence that had characterized his earlier interactions began to fracture. He asked questions that appeared increasingly defensive. His attempts to assert authority over the situation grew weaker, as it became clear that the investigation was no longer speculative. It was now evidentiary. As remains were recovered and documented, investigators worked carefully to maintain chain of custody and preserve the integrity of the scene. Each discovery required documentation, careful handling, and forensic evaluation. The process was slow, deliberate, and emotionally taxing for those involved. The realization that they were recovering victims from beneath a suburban home added a psychological weight, that could not be easily separated from the technical demands of the investigation. Inside the police department, communication intensified. Supervisors were briefed continuously as the scope of the discovery expanded. The case of Robert Piest, which had initiated the investigation, now existed within a much larger framework. It was no longer an isolated disappearance, but part of a broader pattern of violent acts that spanned years. The confirmation of multiple victims beneath the house fundamentally altered the trajectory of the case. As the investigation unfolded in real time, attention began to shift toward legal containment. Authorities needed to ensure that Gacy could be formally charged and detained based on the evidence emerging from the property. The transition from investigation to prosecution was already underway, even as excavation continued. Each new discovery strengthened the legal foundation for what would become one of the most significant criminal cases in Illinois history. The emotional impact on those present at the scene was difficult to fully articulate. Officers who had participated in countless investigations found themselves confronting a level of concealment that felt both deliberate and prolonged. The idea that multiple human beings had been buried beneath a residential home, in a space so close to everyday life, created a psychological dissonance that lingered even as procedures continued. As the scope of the findings expanded, so too did the urgency to identify victims. Forensic teams faced the difficult task of recovering remains in conditions that complicated immediate identification. Time had already affected the integrity of many of the bodies. Yet each recovery represented a person who had once lived, spoken, and been part of a family that was still waiting for answers. For Robert Piest's family, the discovery brought a devastating clarity that replaced uncertainty with confirmation of their deepest fears. The possibility that had lingered for weeks now gave way to reality. Their son's disappearance was no longer a mystery in the abstract sense. It had become part of a confirmed pattern of violence tied directly to the man investigators had been pursuing. Within the broader investigation, the scale of what had been uncovered forced immediate reassessment. The house was no longer simply a crime scene. It was a repository of evidence spanning multiple cases. Each discovery added complexity to the task ahead, both in terms of legal proceedings and forensic analysis. Investigators now faced the challenge of documenting not only individual crimes, but the structure of a system of concealment that had operated over an extended period of time. As excavation continued into its later stages, the full magnitude of the situation began to take shape. The number of victims uncovered exceeded initial expectations, confirming that the house had been used repeatedly for burial. This realization marked a turning point in the investigation, as it became clear that John Wayne Gacy was not responsible for a single act of violence, but for a sustained pattern of killings. The legal implications of this discovery were immediate and far-reaching. Authorities prepared to transition from investigative operations to formal charges. Evidence collected from the site would form the foundation of prosecution. Statements, forensic findings, and recovered remains all contributed to a case that was rapidly becoming one of the most significant in the state's history. As the search concluded its initial phase, the house stood transformed once again. It was no longer just a site of suspicion or investigation. It had become the center of confirmed tragedy, a location where hidden acts had finally been brought into the light. The silence beneath its foundation had been broken, replaced by evidence that could no longer be ignored or denied. And as investigators stepped back from the crawl space, the full reality of what had been uncovered settled over the case with undeniable weight. The investigation had crossed its most critical threshold. What remained was not discovery, but accountability. After the excavation beneath the house on West Summerdale Avenue, nothing about the case of John Wayne Gacy remained contained within its original boundaries. What had begun as a missing person investigation centered on a single teenage boy had expanded into one of the most disturbing criminal revelations in American law enforcement history. The discovery of multiple bodies beneath the suburban home did not just confirm suspicions. It redefined the scale of the crimes entirely. The scene itself was now treated with the highest level of forensic priority. Every fragment of evidence recovered from beneath the house was documented with extreme care. Soil layers were analyzed for disturbances that might indicate additional burial activity. Remains were carefully transported for identification procedures. The crawl space, once an unnoticed structural feature of a quiet suburban home, had become the center of a complex forensic investigation involving dozens of human lives. As the scope of the discovery became clear, law enforcement agencies coordinated across multiple levels. Local police were joined by state authorities and forensic specialists, who had been brought in to manage the unprecedented scale of evidence. The priority shifted from searching for answers to organizing them. Each victim needed to be identified, each case needed to be documented, and each connection to missing persons reports needed to be confirmed. The emotional atmosphere surrounding the investigation was heavy but controlled. Officers and forensic personnel worked with professional discipline, yet the weight of what they were handling was impossible to ignore. Many had expected to find evidence of a single crime. Instead, they were confronted with a pattern that suggested years of undetected violence. The realization that so many lives had ended beneath a single residential structure created a sense of disbelief that lingered even during routine procedures. John Wayne Gacy was formally taken into custody, as the evidence from the house solidified into undeniable proof. His arrest marked the transition from suspicion to prosecution. Inside the legal system, the case quickly escalated in importance. Prosecutors began assembling charges that reflected the full extent of the evidence. The number of victims grew as identification progressed, eventually confirming that at least 33 young men and boys had been killed. During interrogation and legal proceedings, Gacy maintained a complex pattern of denial and partial acknowledgement. At times he attempted to minimize the scope of his actions. At other times he made statements that appeared contradictory or dismissive. His behavior did not follow a consistent psychological pattern that investigators could easily interpret. What remained consistent, however, was the overwhelming evidence recovered from his property, which stood independently of his statements. The trial that followed became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in the state of Illinois. Public attention intensified as details of the investigation were released. The image of a suburban contractor, who had simultaneously maintained a public identity as a community figure while committing serial murders beneath his own home, created a profound shock in public perception. The idea that such extensive crimes could remain hidden within an ordinary neighborhood challenged assumptions about safety and visibility. In court, the prosecution presented a structured case built on forensic evidence, victim identification, and the pattern of disappearances linked to Gacy's activities. The defense attempted to challenge elements of procedure and interpretation, but the physical evidence from the house carried overwhelming weight. The crawl space beneath the home had transitioned from a suspected site of concealment to a documented crime scene containing multiple victims. The families of the victims attended proceedings in varying degrees of visibility. For many, the trial represented the first confirmation of what had happened to their loved ones after years of uncertainty. The process of identification brought both closure and renewed grief. Each confirmed name transformed abstract loss into confirmed tragedy. The courtroom became a space where absence was finally given definition, even if that definition carried unbearable weight. Robert Piest's case remained central throughout the legal proceedings. As the individual whose disappearance initiated the investigation, his story became a critical link between suspicion and discovery. His name represented the moment when the pattern surrounding Gacy began to unravel. For his family, however, that significance did not lessen the personal loss. The confirmation of his fate ended uncertainty, but did not reduce the emotional impact of what had been uncovered. As the trial progressed, the psychological portrait of Gacy became a subject of intense examination. Experts analyzed his behavior, attempting to understand how he had managed to sustain a dual existence for so long. The concept of a double life became central to discussions surrounding the case. By day, he had operated within social and professional environments. By night, he had committed acts that remained hidden beneath the surface of that same life. The contrast between public perception and hidden reality became one of the defining aspects of the case's legacy. It forced investigators, psychologists, and the public to confront the limitations of surface-level judgment. Gacy had not lived in isolation. He had interacted with neighbors, employers, employees, and community members who saw him as ordinary, or even positive in certain contexts. The realization that this perception had coexisted with such extensive violence created lasting questions about trust and recognition. In 1980, the jury returned a verdict that reflected the weight of the evidence presented. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on multiple counts of murder. The sentencing phase followed, resulting in a formal sentence of death. The legal process marked the conclusion of the trial phase, but not the end of public attention or psychological impact. The case had already extended beyond courtroom boundaries into cultural and historical significance. While incarcerated, Gacy continued to generate attention through behavior that included painting, correspondence, and attempts to maintain public visibility. These actions were interpreted in multiple ways, but none altered the legal outcome or the established facts of the case. His imprisonment became a secondary phase of public fascination, though for investigators and families, the focus remained on the victims and the implications of what had been uncovered. In 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection in Illinois. The execution marked the formal conclusion of the legal system's involvement in the case. However, the broader impact of the investigation continued far beyond that moment. The case had already become part of criminal justice history, studied for its implications in forensic science, behavioral profiling, and investigative procedure. The legacy of the case extended into multiple areas of law enforcement practice. It contributed to changes in how missing persons cases were coordinated across jurisdictions. It influenced the development of more structured approaches to identifying patterns in serial crimes. It also reinforced the importance of forensic excavation techniques in cases involving suspected concealed remains. The investigation beneath the Gacy house became a reference point in criminal procedure training and forensic education. Culturally, the case left a lasting imprint on public consciousness. The image of a serial killer operating within a suburban environment challenged assumptions about safety and familiarity. It influenced media representations of crime, particularly in film, literature, and documentary analysis. The figure of the killer clown became a symbolic reference point, representing the disturbing contrast between appearance and reality. For the families of the victims, however, the legacy was personal rather than symbolic. It was defined by absence, memory, and the long process of coming to terms with confirmed loss. Each identified victim represented a life interrupted, a future removed, and a family permanently altered. The legal resolution of the case did not erase that reality, but it did provide answers that had been denied for years. In the end, the case of John Wayne Gacy became more than a record of crimes. It became a study in hidden violence, institutional limitations, and the fragile boundary between normalcy and horror. Beneath a single suburban house, investigators uncovered not only physical evidence, but a confrontation with the limits of perception itself. And long after the house ceased to be a crime scene, the questions it raised continued to echo through every discussion of how such a reality could exist unnoticed for so long, in a place that once seemed completely ordinary. Long after the legal proceedings ended and the physical evidence had been catalogued, the case of John Wayne Gacy continued to exist in a space beyond courtroom walls. It had already become something larger than a criminal investigation. It had turned into a reference point for how society understands hidden violence, fractured identity, and the limits of perception. Yet for those closest to the victims, and for the investigators who worked the case, the aftermath was not abstract. It was persistent, personal, and in many ways unfinished. The house on West Summerdale Avenue, once the center of discovery, did not return to normal life after the excavation. Even though the soil was eventually documented, the remains removed, and the site processed, the meaning of the location had permanently changed. It no longer belonged to the rhythm of suburban familiarity. It belonged instead to memory, investigation, and forensic history. People who passed by the property in later years often did so with awareness of what had once been hidden there, even if the structure itself remained outwardly unchanged. For the investigators, the psychological impact of the case lingered long after the evidence was secured. Many described the experience as something that did not fully resolve when the case file closed. It resurfaced in unexpected ways. Certain details remained fixed in memory, not because of their graphic nature alone, but because of the contradiction they represented. The idea that so many lives had been concealed beneath an ordinary home continued to challenge assumptions about predictability in criminal behavior. The process of victim identification extended beyond the initial trial period. Each recovered set of remains required forensic analysis that sometimes took years to complete. Families waited through long periods of uncertainty before receiving confirmation. For some, the identification brought closure in a technical sense, allowing them to understand what had happened. For others, it reopened emotional wounds that had been suspended during the years of not knowing. Grief in these cases did not follow a single pattern. Some families had spent years holding on to hope that their loved ones might still be alive. Others had slowly accepted absence without explanation. When confirmation finally arrived, it collapsed all previous uncertainty into a single irreversible truth. That moment did not end the emotional impact. It transformed it into something more defined, but not necessarily more bearable. The broader public reaction to the case also evolved over time. Initially, there was shock, followed by fascination, and eventually a more reflective form of engagement. Documentaries, books, and psychological studies began to analyze not only the crimes themselves, but the conditions that allowed them to remain hidden for so long. The focus shifted from sensational detail to systemic questions about investigative limitations, social perception, and the psychology of deception. One of the most enduring aspects of the case was the concept of dual identity. John Wayne Gacy had managed to maintain a public persona that was not only functional, but socially accepted. He participated in community events, ran a business, and engaged with local institutions. This external identity was not a disguise in the traditional sense of isolation. It was integrated into everyday life. That integration made detection significantly more difficult, because it aligned with expectations of normal behavior. The contrast between that public identity and the reality uncovered beneath his home forced a reconsideration of how people interpret familiarity. It challenged the assumption that visibility equates to safety. Gacy was not hidden in isolation. He was present in social systems that did not recognize him as a threat until evidence forced reinterpretation. That realization became one of the most studied aspects of the case in criminal psychology and law enforcement training. Within forensic science, the case contributed to significant procedural reflection. The excavation of the crawl space demonstrated the importance of environmental awareness in missing persons investigations. It showed how physical spaces could be altered in ways that concealed evidence for extended periods. It also reinforced the need for coordinated approaches between investigative teams when dealing with patterns that span multiple cases over time. The development of behavioral profiling techniques in later years was also influenced by cases like this. While profiling alone could not prevent the crimes, it provided a framework for recognizing patterns that might otherwise remain disconnected. The repeated association of Gacy with vulnerable young men, informal employment arrangements, and isolated encounters became part of broader studies into offender behavior patterns. Yet even with these developments, the case continued to raise questions that did not have complete answers. One of the most persistent questions was how many opportunities for intervention might have existed earlier. Investigators, psychologists, and legal analysts examined the timeline repeatedly, not to assign blame in simplistic terms, but to understand the structural gaps that allowed the pattern to continue unnoticed. The limitations of communication between jurisdictions played a role. Missing persons reports were often handled locally, without centralized data comparison. This made it difficult to identify connections across cases that appeared unrelated on the surface. In Gacy's case, the victims came from different backgrounds and were reported missing at different times, which further obscured the pattern until it reached a critical threshold. Another factor was perception. The victims were primarily young males, many of whom were transitioning between adolescence and adulthood. In the context of the 1970s, missing teenagers were not always treated with the same urgency as younger children. Assumptions about voluntary disappearance or lifestyle choices sometimes delayed deeper investigation. These assumptions, while not universal, contributed to slower pattern recognition. The case also influenced public awareness of serial offenses in a broader cultural sense. Before it gained national attention, the idea of a serial killer operating within an ordinary suburban environment was not widely integrated into public understanding of crime. After Gacy, that perception shifted. The concept of hidden danger within familiar spaces became a recurring theme in media, education, and public discourse. For those directly involved in the investigation, however, the case remained grounded in human consequence rather than abstract analysis. Officers who worked on the excavation and subsequent investigation often described the experience as something that stayed with them long after retirement. Not because of fear, but because of the weight of realization that ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary harm. The families of the victims continued to carry the longest legacy of the case. Their lives were permanently altered by absence, but also by the long process of waiting for answers. Even after identification and legal resolution, the emotional impact did not conclude. Instead, it became part of their ongoing personal history. The case did not end for them in 1980 or 1994. It continued in memory, anniversaries, and the absence of futures that were never lived. Over time, the house itself became a symbol rather than just a location. It represented the intersection between visibility and concealment, between ordinary life and hidden violence. It stood as a reminder that physical familiarity does not guarantee emotional or psychological transparency. That symbolism extended beyond the immediate community and into broader cultural understanding. In the decades following the case, discussions about it often focused on prevention, awareness, and systemic improvement. Law enforcement training incorporated lessons learned from the investigation. Forensic science advanced in part due to the need for better identification methods. Databases for missing persons and unidentified remains became more interconnected, reflecting lessons drawn from cases that had once been fragmented across jurisdictions. Yet despite these developments, the core emotional reality of the case remained unchanged. At its center were individuals whose lives ended prematurely and families who experienced prolonged uncertainty. That human dimension is what continues to define the case, even as it is analyzed through psychological, legal, and cultural frameworks. The final reflection on the case does not rest in the actions of John Wayne Gacy alone. It rests in the broader understanding of how such actions were able to remain undetected within ordinary structures of life. It raises questions about perception, attention, and the boundaries of trust within communities. In the end, the story is not only about crime or investigation. It is about the fragile distance between what is seen and what is hidden, between familiarity and truth, and between the assumption of safety and the reality that sometimes exists beneath it. And long after the investigation concluded, that distance remained the most difficult thing to fully comprehend.